Before I introduce our speakers, I just wanted to give you an overall outline of the structure of the webinar. Camille and Glynis will speak around the importance of the school having clear principles to guide the shaping of the provision before speaking about the roles and responsibilities of different members of the school staff in terms of meeting the provision for learners who use English as an additional language. They will also look more closely at ways of planning that provision, and there'll be opportunities to share relevant resources throughout. If there's time at the end, we will take questions, any questions that you may have. So please do use the Q&A box to send any questions that you would like to ask to the speakers as they come to you, and I will collect them and pose them at the end if there's time. Tomorrow you'll receive an email from us with a link to access the video recording of this webinar. You will also get a sheet with all of the links and references that have been shared throughout the webinar. So while some of them will be shared in the chat box today, they will all be available in a document tomorrow. So Lizzie, before we move on, could we have a look at the results of the polls, please? Fantastic. So we can see then that we've got 53% of participants here are EAL coordinators, and of those leading EAL in their school, 37% were new to the role this academic year. So I think that gives us a really, really clear indication that there's been a real shift, and that there's a huge number of people who are new to the role, and where we can also see on the third question that 49% received absolutely no training at all for starting this role. So hopefully you will find something very, very useful in this webinar. So enough of me. Let me introduce our speakers. So Glynis Lloyd joined the Bell Foundation in 2022 as a trainer. She's worked in English language education as a teacher, teacher trainer, textbook writer, and commissioning editor. She holds an M.Ed in Applied Language and Linguistics and a PGCE. She's undertaken research in literacy and teacher development projects in EAL contexts in South Africa and Ghana. She works on course design and resource development for teachers in EAL settings. Kamil Trebiataski joined the Bell Foundation in September 2018. He holds the post of Digital Resource Developer. Before joining the foundation, Kamil spent 18 years teaching English as a foreign language and English as an additional language, first in Poland and subsequently in England and Scotland in mainstream secondary classrooms. He was an EAL coordinator at a secondary school, EAL consultant and trainer, and a writer for education periodicals and EAL event organizer. Thank you very much, Kamil. I'll hand over for now.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so first we're just going to look at the intentions behind this webinar and what we hope to achieve. So what I want to do here today is first learn about the principles that underpin effective EAL provision. We want to look at what your role and responsibilities in this role are. Have a little bit of a look at how to plan the development of EAL provision and aim to effect school-wide change, and familiarize yourself with a selection of some resources, because that's obviously always practical and useful. And so all of this, we hope, will help you lead EAL provision in your school, and in so doing better serve the needs of learners using EAL. So, okay, here you have the list of the sections into which we divided our webinar today. So we're going to start with guiding principles. And we're actually going to do another quick poll. And the idea here is you can see the number of pupils in England. That is all of them. How many pupils do you think are classified as using English as an additional language? Hopefully we can have the poll up, and if you could choose one of these options, and then I'm going to show you the correct answer on the next slide. So just give it a minute. Let's see. So we've got either over 1.5 million or over 2 million. Just maybe give it another 15 seconds, because most of you have already answered that. Okay. Thank you. Okay, so we've got 50% of you thinking that it's C, over 1.5 million, and 45% of you thinking that it's over 2 million. The answer is actually C, and so most of you were very, very close to the correct answer. So this means that almost 1 in 5 of all pupils in England use English as an additional language. And so this means that it is highly unlikely that a teacher working in England would not encounter a learner who uses EAL in their classroom in their teaching career, including teachers who might teach in more remote rural areas. While this group of learners might be a minority, it is certainly a sizable minority, and it is even more the reason that the provision for this group is of high quality. There is some anecdotal evidence that there are more new EAL coordinators, including in some schools, receiving children who are refugees, but who, coordinators, have previously have little or no experience of teaching and coordinating EAL. So it's very important to remember that provision in schools, although important for refugee learners, of course, needs to extend beyond them to support all learners who use EAL. And it's also important to consider your local context of your school. We'll talk about this more in the webinar, in determining the nature of your provision. For example, how many learners new to English there are versus more competent in English language ones. Okay. And also, let's, here you can see these numbers gives you more of an idea of what these numbers look like in nurseries, primary schools, special schools, and PRUs as well. Okay. So I'm going to ask you to just write one thing that you think is a challenge in your work as, as EAL coordinator. We mean here just the first thing that comes to your mind and just one line, just to get a sort of overview of what kind of issues we might be facing. So if you could put that in the chat box, we'll see what kind of issues might come up the most. So we've got support, assessment, curriculum accessing the curriculum, funding, time, certainly, time to support children effectively, lack of time, lots of workload, differentiation, so there will be strategies, assessment. Obviously the similar kind of areas come up in your responses. Thank you very much for these. So we're going to, thank you very much, that's fantastic. So we are going to now look at how that aligns with what we are thinking. So what are the potential issues? So in the more recent government documents, such as Ofsted's New Education Inspection Framework, the term EAL is actually invisible in that it's not specifically mentioned as a distinct group. Rather, all pupils encompassing terms such as learners or all learners are used. And in some respects, this could be seen as positive, as to say these learners are not others or portrayed as different from other learners in the schools, but it also means that their distinct needs, those stemming from the English language barrier, might be missed or forgotten about. Secondly, in the past, funding available for those learners was ring-fenced and available to be spent only on this group of learners by school, but this is no longer possible. And in light of what just mentioned, the invisibility of EAL, this will often mean very small budgets in schools. And some of you mentioned that in the chat just now, available for resources that multilingual learners might benefit from. Some schools, for instance, choose to use their pupil premium funding for resourcing learners using EAL. Then the fact that schools are typically no longer accountable to local authorities can mean that they might choose to deprioritize the needs of learners using EAL and support this group less than might otherwise be the case. In the past, some local authorities set up a central EAL resource center, for example, in some cities, where practitioners could borrow books, access resources, and in some cases even receive some EAL pedagogy training. But unfortunately, this no longer applies. There are no qualifications required for the position of EAL coordinator and EAL teacher, in fact, meaning that sometimes EAL staff are not trained for this demanding role and they might be unsure what is required of them. Training, particularly face-to-face, can be difficult to find or get to. And then there's not enough time given to do the work. And you mentioned this yourselves already. Sometimes one member of staff that has two roles, for example, a mainstream classroom teacher and EAL coordinator, and then they have maybe only a few hours available per week for the EAL coordination duties, which is not sufficient to serve the needs of learners using EAL. There might be other responsibilities, such as being a SENCO, for example. And we will speak later a little bit more about EAL and SEN. And finally, there are times where the description itself of the role of EAL coordinator is vague and not clear. The job requirements of the role can vary greatly from school to school. And so as much as possible, it is in the interest of the coordinator to know exactly what is expected of them before the job starts. Okay, I'm now going to pass over to Glynis to look specifically at guiding principles. So Glynis, if you can come on and take over from here.
Thank you, Camille, and hello, everyone. So in the section I'm talking about now, we're going to start looking at the idea of adopting guiding principles that can then underpin your policy and your practice to make sure that you can deliver effective EAL provision. And we look here at the importance of values and the importance in particular of inclusivity as a guiding value. And here the work of Evans and in fact a big team of researchers based largely at Cambridge University, urge us to create a culture where values around the inclusion of EAL students are explicit. In other words, they're clear in your policies, all of the staff working in this space are clear about them, and these values are shared across the school, and that this then makes for a coherent and cohesive foundation on which you can build your practice. And how do we realize that as we build an inclusive pedagogy? And this team of researchers again have devised a set of 4 dimensions of inclusion. First of all, we talk about academic inclusion, and I'll go into some detail there to look at what that means. Secondly is the area of linguistic inclusion, and I'll talk about that in more detail. Thirdly is the question of teachers' attitudes. How do teachers view multilingual children and include them in their teaching and in school life? And thirdly, more specifically around school life more broadly, is the question of social inclusion. And, we want to make the point that there might be some extreme situations where you feel that a child needs a particularly a period of induction, but we would urge that's very short, and that as soon as possible, children are integrated into mainstream classes and activities across the school. So then looking at academic inclusion, what does that look like? How do we apply that to learners using EAL? And of course, we want to highlight the fact that schooling is fundamentally a linguistic process, and content is presented and accessed through language. So it means that the issue of language and English is important across all parts of the curriculum. And so the first aspect of academic inclusion is welcoming and including children in mainstream classrooms. And finding ways to make sure that they are secure in that space. And that's can be done in a number of ways, but crucially giving them space to use the languages that they know. And then other means, for example, appointing an empathetic child who can be a buddy, who can guide them through activities, what is happening in the school day, and so on. The second point around academic inclusion is, as with all children, setting and maintaining high expectations. And we're going to talk about that in more detail a bit later, but at this point, just to say that there shouldn't be any idea about dumbing down the curriculum in any way. You might have a learner, for example, who's very, very skilled at maths, and so it's the language support that's required there, not making the curriculum any easier or simpler. The third aspect is taking advantage of each individual child's strengths and talents. So this is not just recognizing that multilingualism is an asset, and we'll talk a lot about assets and an asset-based approach as we work through the webinar, but also finding out about things that they're good at, they like doing, drama, art, for example. They might be able to play chess, which they can teach other children, and so on. And then fourthly, is recognizing the specific language profile and education history of each child. So that's finding out right at the beginning what languages they use, for what literacy learning they might have done already in the languages that they know, and what schooling more broadly they might have had. And making sure that this information, creating these profiles for each child with all this information, is then shared by any teacher who is going to be teaching them. Then to look at a second aspect of that's very important in academic inclusion is creating a clear separation between English additional language and special education needs. That it's very important not to confuse or conflate those two things. So for example, if you're concerned, you might be concerned that the child might be dyslexic or might have any other special education need. And we will be sharing links to really useful tools that you can use to assess that. But overall, as with any other population of children, a small minority might have special education needs, but the two things don't necessarily go together. And I'm very pleased just to say that the Bell Foundation will shortly be launching guidance and resources for school practitioners who can, to assist them in ascertaining whether children who are learning English as an additional language might have a special education need. Now to talk about the second dimension of the inclusive pedagogy, which is linguistic. And just to say at the outset that language is a significant part of our identity. Whatever language or languages we live in and we know, that's a significant part of who we are. So affirming the languages that children learning English as an additional language know means welcoming and including them, and it means recognizing them. So how do you do that? Firstly, create a multilingual school environment. Look at aspects around your school. Does your school celebrate through signage, through posters, through various sort of public ways to celebrate all the languages in your school community? And the second aspect of linguistic inclusion is recognizing each child's rich language repertoire in the way that you build that into the support and the programs and the learning that they're going to do across the curriculum. So giving them opportunities in their lessons and beyond to use the languages that they know. And to really embrace the idea that multilingualism is an asset. It's an asset to your classrooms, to all the children in your classrooms, to gain extra knowledge about language and a wider experience. Secondly, on the issue of linguistic inclusion, is linking language learning with content learning. So again, that goes to the idea that how very language-based all learning is, and the need, therefore, to acknowledge that children learning EAL, learning English as an additional language, are really doing two things at the same time. They're learning a new language, and they're learning to learn in that language. And so that really means that in every lesson, in every subject, there will be language challenges. So for example, if it's a science lesson, teachers needing to think about what the key concepts are, highlighting key vocabulary, which can then be translated, and so on. So teachers are really going to be teaching English and teaching for the curriculum. The third aspect of the inclusive pedagogy goes to teachers' inclusive attitudes. And this really is another key part of the EAL coordinator's role, which is the ongoing training, professional development of your staff, and the need to work with your teachers to view new arrivals as assets. And of course, this potentially, especially if it's a new experience for teachers, is potentially daunting. You know, they've got a busy classroom, 30 children with multiple needs and so on. And they might be inclined to say, but it's just easier if this child can be withdrawn and learn more quietly. But I think it's really key to remind them that having children learning EAL in their lessons, that they bring with them unique cultural and linguistic experiences which teachers can harness, and that can build real rich experience in their classrooms, where all of the children can build tolerance and compassion, for new children. And then lastly, the last aspect, the last dimension, is social inclusion, as I mentioned, to make sure that from day one, children, new arrivals, are included in all aspects of the school community, all aspects of the school day, outings, and so on. And that, again, your policies build in support to enable them to participate just like everybody else. I want to then move on to the question of the EAL policy in your school, and to look at, we've identified about nine key aspects of that policy. So you may, for example, already have a policy in place. Hopefully just my highlighting some of these will give you an opportunity just to go back and review it. Or you may, in fact, be starting out and not yet have a policy, and this may be one of your many roles as the coordinator. So firstly, I've talked about values and vision. I've talked about the values of defining children as multilingual, and talking about the school's position on language and identity, their access to the broad curriculum, and using their full linguistic repertoires in their learning. Secondly, is setting out your school context. So that's looking at all the languages and cultures and ethnicities in your school community, how many languages are represented, the numbers and percentages of children who are learning English as an additional language, their profiles, where they might be in the stages of English proficiency, and then the number of pupils who qualify for the pupil premium. Just on the matter of funding, if you are lucky enough to have access to any funding, your policy could spell out how that's going to be utilized. Thirdly is the issue of key responsibilities. Who has responsibility for what to support EAL provision? So that includes setting out responsibilities of your senior leadership team, who in that team might be ultimately responsible for English additional language provision. Is there a governor with responsibility for this? What are the main responsibilities of the EAL coordinator? And then any other staff, teachers, teaching assistants, and so on, what would their main responsibilities be? And then fourthly, setting out your expectations for teaching and learning and the assessment of learners who use EAL. So what strategies will you be putting in place to support access to the mainstream curriculum? And that's teaching strategies, resources that you might be able to access, translation resources, for example. Secondly, there is planning for language development. And thirdly, the big issue of assessment, which some of you noted as one of the big challenges that you face, target setting for children and tracking their progress. Number 5 is your procedures for the induction and admissions of new arrivals. What is going to happen before they start, meetings with the family and so on, identifying what any special needs they might have, and an initial assessment, an assessment in the languages that they know, and then what support are you going to put in place, like a buddy system for those first days after they arrive. Number 6 is, as we've mentioned, being able to identify any of the new learners who do have a special education need and what support protocols you'll be putting in place for them. Number 7, again, you've raised this as one of your challenges, which is training and ongoing professional development, and your policy could set out how your staff are informed and equipped to implement the latest best evidence where that's relevant. Number 8 is the issue, and I saw some of you also mentioned this one, family engagement and working with the wider community. So what sort of support can you put in place to maintain the development of the languages that the children speak at home? How are these families, how are parents included in your school community? And what connections can be made for them in the broader community? And then number 9 is just a point about how often you'll be reviewing and evaluating your policy and who will be doing that.
Okay, I think it's time for me to take over. Thanks, Glynis. So now that we've considered those guiding principles to adopt in the work of EAL coordinators, let us think specifically about practicalities. So that's the next section, your role and responsibilities in this role, and then actually a little bit about what is not your responsibility. Okay. So here we've got this slide. There's quite a lot of information on the slide about the different types of responsibilities. So, okay. So a lot what you listed already before, when we asked you that original question for the chat room, that coincides quite a lot with what the Foundation considers to be EAL coordinators' responsibility. So please keep in mind that what we present here is not necessarily listed in the order of priority. Each school context will be different, and therefore these priorities will be different. Nonetheless, let's have a look. So identifying and keeping records of learners using EAL. So typically on admission, schools will already know that learners coming to them are those using EAL, but there might be cases where some analysis will be required. Learners might be children of mixed heritage, for example, or different ethnicity parents. For example, I once had a Thai student by the surname Watson, and so the surname didn't make it immediately apparent that this learner belonged to this group, or information about a learner language might be missing from the admission form, and more analysis might be required. And so your input might be needed. More importantly, perhaps, however, is that your role will include keeping records of those learners, most likely in the form of a kind of a EAL register with information such as languages, ethnicity, current language, English language proficiency of a learner recorded. So that's the first. This links to the next two aspects of the role. And the first one we have here, monitoring their progress and tracking their attainment. And that should be preceded by assessment of their language development needs. The assessment of their English language using a tool such as our EAL assessment framework for schools should be done at least after 2 weeks have passed after the learner's first day at school. And that's quite simply because otherwise these results are likely to be skewed simply due to the fact that the learner is just simply too stressed because of the new environment and everything that they have to take in being in the new country. So assessing their language will only will also assess not only their English language, but ideally learners' home language literacy, if at all possible. We've got guidance on home language assessment, which we will be sharing with you as well. I'd like to stress that the assessment itself does not necessarily need to be conducted by the coordinators. It could be a TA or another teacher, but it should certainly be a person who is trained for the task. And following the initial assessments, progress and attainment should be tracked at regular intervals. Doing so half-termly is probably too much workload in most cases, so we would suggest termly. Monitoring progress also here refers not only to curricular progress, but also progress in the English language development. So this will enable to determine more firmly if learners struggle with a particular subject, academic domain, or whether it's due to their English language barrier or cognitive academic difficulties with the subject itself, for instance. So in other words, is lower attainments the issue with science or the language in science, that kind of thing. Then we've got supporting other staff, teachers and others. So one of the responsibilities of the EAL coordinators is supporting teachers via CPD. If you feel knowledgeable and confident enough to do so, it can be yourself and can take a variety of forms. So it could be through an inset session, through individual conversations, through informal conversations, or informal sessions delivered to smaller groups of teachers or TAs. And maybe even arranging for a weekly drop-in time where teachers can come to you and ask you questions or ask you for advice. But it is equally possible to simply point to and help arrange for external training for school, such as alerting the school to the courses such as the ones that we run. And so, of course, this CPT, formal or informal, would not be limited to EAL assessment, but could cover a number of different areas. Working with SLT can be a daunting task sometimes, but it is important. Many things simply cannot be arranged for without an input or agreement from the SLT. Certainly funding would fall into that category if you want to purchase some resources, but also working towards multilingual ethos across the school, organizing EAL insets sessions, CPD, and so on. So in general, the more the SLT, the senior leaders are on board with the EAL pedagogy and approaches, the easier it will be for you to make positive changes in your school. Helping to ensure that the curriculum resources reflect school diversity is important. Where learners see that the resources and programs of learning reflect the experiences of pupils such as themselves, they will feel more included in the school community, which is likely to increase their motivation and commitment to learning and sense of belonging. So you can work with teachers, suggest improvements to programs of learning and resources. Supporting parents to support their children's learning. We'll have Glynis will come back later and talk a little bit more about working with parents and the communities. But where parents and carers of learners are more involved, it can only help children to succeed. Parents of multilingual learners sometimes might feel unable to help their children with school homework, particularly where they themselves are new to English. And it is useful to remind them that they can support learning their own language. As I said, we'll suggest some more ideas a little bit later today. And final one is planning, teaching, and monitoring support. This relates to organizing an induction program. We share some resources for that towards the end of the webinar, but there's not enough time in today's webinar to speak about all of it in detail, but we will talk about things more that are available for that. But any induction needs to be time limited, so have no longer than 12 weeks to have terms, and it should be linked to the curriculum. In light of what we said already, what Glynis was talking about learning English and through English, learning the subject matter and English. And just finally, before we move on, earlier on I mentioned that we would talk a little bit about what is not your responsibility. So just to say, it is the responsibility of all teachers to teach multilingual learners in subjects, in curriculum. But it is not your job, however, to come into a classroom that is not yours and provide support, sort of replacement support for regular teaching, including when some teachers might feel, particularly with new arrivals, who are new to English, that they are not ready for the mainstream classroom. So sometimes such teachers might insist that those learners must be withdrawn to EAL classes, but teacher standards clearly state that it is every teacher's responsibility to teach all learners, including those with EAL. So just to say that. Okay. We're now going to move on to the next section, which is planning EAL provision. And so we are going to start with long-term planning. So what you see here is, on the right, we've got an EAL action plan that comes from one of our online courses, in fact. Let's just have a look at, so an effective and workable EAL action plan puts you in charge of the EAL provision and enables you to lead, but equally, it draws in your colleagues and involves the senior leader team. The more your colleagues know about EAL pedagogy, EAL approaches, strategies, assessment, the better the provision will be for the learners, because there will be greater consistency across the school. So the action plan that you see here includes responsibilities, realistic timescales, so and resources that might include human resources, expected impact, what you expect for the results and change to occur from that, and will you have any numbers, data, any evidence that this progress has occurred, that this change has occurred. Then in long-term planning, it's useful to consider how you would or might integrate EAL with other areas of the school, such as special educational needs, family engagement, safeguarding, admissions, and more. The long-term plan on 2 slides before will include planning for admission and induction of new arrivals who use EAL. And so we would suggest that EAL profiles are written for those learners and that they are shared with other staff. That doesn't necessarily mean just teachers. That could be pastoral leads and anyone else who will be involved with those learners. Now, I should say that we are not suggesting that you should write an EAL profile for every learner in your school. That is clearly impossible in terms of workloads. But typically you try them for those learners who are new to English. and then it would, the context of your school would dictate how much you are able to do and when to perhaps stop. But I certainly have never known of any school that would be able to write EAL profiles for all the learners. So just consider your workload and what is realistic. So these profiles should be shared with other staff. Encourage teachers to see the unique nature of each child. So you see what the kind of things that are on this profile here, which is available from our website for free, this particular example. But we've got ethnicity, home language, proficiency in English, is the learner literate in their first language, how old the child was when they arrived in the UK, and you can also have information about religion, but also hobbies, what they are good at, and what they excel at, and so on. And finally, these profiles could suggest what support should be offered to the child and what can be expected of them in terms of their strengths and needs. So now we are going to look at how we can think about the EAL provision in your school using those 3 different foci or focuses. And you can see here that we've got whole school ethos, teaching and learning, and family liaison. I'm going to do the first 2, present the first 2, and Glynis is going to present the last one for you. So we're going to start with this one, whole school ethos. So I'm going to ask you to very quickly share one idea how you think you could promote a multilingual culture in your school, and then I'll show you how it aligns with our own ideas. Yeah, so we've got displays, some community posters, cultural days, inviting parents in, end of the week, absolutely. Okay, International Week, maps with links, perhaps with different languages spoken at the school as well, celebrating cultures, fantastic, thank you very much. I'm going to move on because I'm quite conscious of the time. So, okay, in terms of establishing a whole school ethos, we want to integrate learners in all school activities. We mentioned this before, and particularly those who are new to English. One thing we could do is to set up buddy schemes for them. One such program is Young Interpreter Scheme from Hampshire County Council, which you can use to sort of train the buddies before they get onto that role, and then they are better equipped to help that learner in their first weeks. The new learner, these typically would be children who speak the same language as the new arrival. Secondly, EAL training for staff, for subject teachers and teaching assistants can and should have a multilingualism focus. And it's also a good time then to address any concern that staff might have about the use of home languages in schools. And multilingualism can be promoted across school, and the ideas that you had there, I think, pretty much speak to the same. We've got science, we've got cultural days. Teachers can learn to say basic phrases such as hello and goodbye, at least in different languages. And those different languages can be visible throughout the school, so that all learners, not just those who are multilingual, can see that linguistic diversity is valued at the school. Okay, going to move on to teaching and learning. So what underpins the effective pedagogy for multilingual learners? So we already said that multilingualism is an asset to be harnessed. Secondly, teachers should have high expectations of multilingual learners as long as they provide appropriate support to remove the English language barriers to the curriculum for them. And thirdly, teaching and learning integrates subjects, content, and language. An effective holistic assessment carried out in the first place will inform these 3 principles and practices and enable teachers and teaching assistants to support those learners in the classroom. So it's only when we know what the strengths and needs of those learners are that we can pitch the support at the appropriate level. So in the classroom, we can incorporate the multicultural, multilingual aspects of the school into the ethos, encourage children to draw on the languages that they know. I mentioned high expectations before, so just we're going to look at that briefly. Maintaining high expectations for every pupil has been perceived as a crucial aspect of learners' education and can be linked to Pygmalion effect introduced by Rosenthal. Following their school research, Rosenthal held that high expectations lead to better performance and low expectations to worse performance. So if a teacher holds low expectations of a pupil, the pupil might behave in a way that confirms that teacher's pre-existing expectations, but also vice versa. So now a learner having low confidence in themselves can therefore become a self-fulfilling prophecy, which is, as you can see here, a false definition of the situation, evoking a behavior which makes the originally false conception come true. Regarding EAL learners, some teachers may take their English language barrier to learning to mean that they are capable of less, leading to lower expectations of them. However, a language barrier has little to do with cognitive giftedness for maths, for example. And so, what does this mean for EAL? Common to all learners is the need to maintain high expectations, and all learners need to be enabled to access the entire curriculum. But specific to EAL is the need for the English language barrier not being a reason for lowering expectations, and language barriers can be removed for learners to engage with the curriculum. And so in short, if we remove the English language barriers and develop the English language by supporting the learners, then we can maintain high expectations of them. So that's the idea. Now, the next 2 slides just show you some resources that we have on our website in the teaching resources, where we integrate the focus on content and language. So they are good examples of the kind of things that we mean. So in this resource, I'm going to display all of it. For a science lesson, we can see how adverbs of time, imperatives, verbs, nouns, adjectives are taught, including how to use articles, an, and some determiners, while the content of the lesson is about the process of growing plants. So they're supported with the English language, but they can participate exactly in the same kind of learning that everyone else in the class. Here is another example from maths, another resource that we have. The present simple tense is taught. So we've got here add and multiply, and learners are presented with the substitution table and the visual supports, enabling them to work with different mathematical problems, just like other learners in the class. Okay. Right. We're going to do this quite quickly. We have 2 questions. In Zoom, you've got an option, reactions. I would like to just for you to raise your hand in Zoom if your school carries out English language proficiency assessment. I'll just see how many raised hands we get. Okay. Some, so we've got, thank you. We've got about 24, 25. Thank you. Yeah, so it looks like it's about that. Then if you could unraise those hands, and those of you who did answer yes to that, do you feel that that information gathered from such assessment effectively informs the teaching and learning in your school? And so perhaps, given that there's about 100 of us, that would suggest that perhaps this is something to investigate in your schools. because we only had about a quarter of you who said that such assessments are carried out. So I'm going to look for 5 minutes at our framework and look at the assessment aspect of it. Here's 2 citations from Strand and Hessel, who carried research into proficiency in English. So you can see there in the first one, proficiency in English is central to understanding achievement and levels of need among pupils with EAL. And then there is a strong link between proficiency in English and educational achievement. The national average in England in 2018 was just above C on these levels, which are the same bands that we use for English language proficiency in our assessment framework. And this is consistent across year groups and subjects. So as mentioned before, the Bell Foundation's offer includes its EAL assessment framework for schools. It's curriculum embedded. It assesses how English is used by learners in the mainstream classroom and promotes formative assessment. So it assesses listening, speaking, reading and viewing, and writing, and it has 5 descriptors, A being new to English, E being fluent. Descriptors can be used to identify targets, while descriptors 1 to 10, so each band, as you can see, has 10 different descriptors. The 1 to 5 from the top indicate early development, and 6 to 10 indicate getting closer to the next band, but they are not expected to be achieved in order. And it's also important to remember that children can have spiky profiles. That means to say that they could be band A in speaking, but band B in writing, for example. I'm going to look at so the framework is designed to assess for language within the curriculum and focuses on language functions rather than particular aspects of English language grammar. So for this reason, it is rare to find there are references to very specific English tenses or terms such as conditional sentences, gerunds, subjunctives, and so on and so forth. Instead, language functions, instead, language functions abound. So for example, if you look at D here, it talks about retelling events rather than using a particular tense to do so. It will be up to a teacher to determine developments and learning of which language structure to support. And it also relieves yourselves, practitioners, from needing to know any particular sophisticated grammatical linguistic terminology. So just once assessed, practitioners will be better placed to determine the level of support a learner will need. So here you can see that a new to English learner, A, needs considerable support, but when we jump up to C, developing competence needs ongoing support to access curriculum fully, but not considerable support anymore, and E operates without EAL support across the curriculum. Downloadable from the same EAL assessment framework webpage on our website are classroom strategies, a large collection of EAL strategies linked to particular bands and skills. So here you can see band A for reading and viewing and writing, and band C for listening and speaking. We're also in the process of updating these, so they're even better than they are. Finally, from me, before Glynis takes over for the last section, here is some additional guidance that you can find on our website. Effective teaching of EAL. These are short articles, multilingual support, and welcoming refugee and asylum-seeking learners. So we are beginning to run out of time, but we still have 5 minutes, so fingers crossed we can get to the end in time. So Glynis, if you want to take over for talking about family liaison. Yeah.
Thank you. So first of all, in this focus, we're going to look at 4 practical strategies that you can use to get parents involved and supporting their children's learning. So the first one there, the first 2 strategies actually would be strategies that you can implement before the child actually starts school. So in your meetings with the child and their parents, caregivers, before they start, a good thing to do would be to provide some information about the curriculum and teaching approaches that characterize teaching in Britain. So, for example, that there's a lot of collaborative learning, that children are encouraged to express ideas and opinions. This might be unknown. It might be a new experience, as the family might have come from a place where there's a more didactic approach, where the teacher's word is law, and so on. So it's just about explaining that experiences and ways of teaching and learning that could be new. Secondly, providing information about your particular school, about the timetables, what happens at the beginning of the day, what happens at the end of the day, and so on. And if you can, have that translated into the languages that the family knows. Thirdly, and this would be more into the time after the child has started, just to promote shared reading. And that can be in the languages that the family speaks at home, so that this aspect that's so key to the primary curriculum of reading is really highlighted, and also then trying to find a space to talk to the parents later on about the value of multilingualism and the value of keeping home languages, maintaining those at home, because of the value of that for learning a new language. Then you could take a review of your school communications, the way in which you communicate with parents, ensuring that that's linguistically accessible through audio or visual communication, perhaps sending text messages which parents can then translate, translating school letters and so on. Secondly is ensuring that they have a voice, perhaps finding a parent who can represent a group of families on, voicing issues, going to governor meetings and so on. And then are there perhaps other family members who can assist with translation in parent meetings? And lastly, just finding ways to offer more support to families, especially those that might be new to Britain, speaking to them personally and on the phone, perhaps seeing if there are ESOL classes they can join to learn English, making special arrangements for them at parents' evenings, and then arranging for support for parents during parent evenings. And thank you. Those are the points. Camille?
Sorry, I unmuted myself. Sorry. Just to say, this section is simply about useful resources, and a lot of them are free for you to access. In fact, all of them are free. Some of them you might need to register with the website. But as you can see here, you can access a lot of our past webinars on a number of topics. You can find out more on our training pages. So here we've got new refugee arrivals, maintaining high expectations, so more on the kind of thing I was talking about earlier, newly arrived pupils who are new to English, and how parents can use home languages to support home learning, which is what Glynis was talking about just now. Now, this webinar is basically a first step, in fact, and we'll be offering an additional one, as you can see here, in February, to go into more detail, particularly into things like EAL initial induction, assessment, working with parents, and basically to become more practical than what we're able to cover today. So as you can see, there will be one for primary on the 1st of February, and the 2nd of February, there will be the one for secondary schools. So hopefully you can join us for that. We also run a number of online courses, of course. So here are some of the ones that are coming up in January, February, and March, and April. introduction to EAL assessment, embedding assessment, leading a whole school strategy for EAL. So that's taking a wider view, perhaps from the perspective of an SLT member, and understanding language for learning in multilingual schools as well. And just to remind you, we have a page where you can download resources for free, many of them for primary context. This is where you would have to register in order to download them, but it is free. We also have a page called Great Ideas, which are basically 20 different types of strategies rather than particular resources. They're the kind of strategies and teaching approaches that you could consider. And we are producing 5 more in early next year to add to that. And some other classroom resources, some of them for new arrivals. Raising to English is an excellent CD full of printable resources. Raising to Literacy is an EAL program for phonics, specifically designed for EAL, and it's available for free from this website. Learning Village is an online software that is also available for tablets. And just the last 2. Online background collation tool for new arrivals. If you have parents coming in for an admission meeting and you would like to acquire the information from them about the background of their learners, and if there is an issue with communication because the parents also do not have, they're not proficient in English language, this tool is translated and it's into 17 languages, I believe, and it's free to use. And finally, you've got a website with translated letters for schools, the kind of letters that are typically sent out about trips, about absences, and so on and so forth. So all of these resources are there. Some reading, I will not go through this because we are already over time, but you will be able to look at that again in the recording of the webinar. But there are magazines, there are pamphlets. Particularly useful is the EAL Coordinator, the first 100 days. That is a Naldic's publication, and other things that we will share with you amongst the links that you are going to get tomorrow. So I don't really think we have time for any kind of questions because we are 4 minutes over time. But I think we would just like to say thank you. I don't know if Caroline wants to come back at the end. Hi. Hello.
Thanks ever so much, everybody, for your patience and for sticking all the way through. If you do have any questions, Camille has said that we will have another webinar in February. If you did have any questions, please do let us know, and we'll do our best to make sure that those issues are picked up in the second webinar wherever possible. So thanks again. You'll get the recording and the document with all of the links on tomorrow by email. Thanks ever so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Bye. Bye-bye.